Our topic for today's training is structuring a tutor session. We have this as part of our new tutor training, and we call you new tutors, but it's not because you've never tutored before. In fact, when I interview people, most students that I talk to, while they're interviewing to be tutors, have tutored people before, whether formally or informally. So you're not new to the idea of tutoring, but what we want to talk about today is how do we structure the time we spend with our students, spend with our tutees, to help bring about the real goals that we have as tutors. So to think about this, we should think about what the goals to tutoring are. And when we think about any tutoring situation, there's two people involved. There's you and there's your tutee. And each of you come to that session with different goals. So it's worth thinking, what are the goals that you have as a tutor and what are the goals that the student you're working with has? So if we think about the student that you're working with, what goals might they have as they're coming in to meet with you? Well, if we think about it, they're going to want to understand the content better. They're going to want to get help with homework. They're going to want to get a good grade in the class. Some students just want to get through the class. I teach CWC here at Bethel. I'm very aware when I was a student here, I was a tutor for CWC, and was very aware of the fact that some students, it's not that they desperately wanted to learn CWC or get a great grade in the class. They just wanted to get through it. They just wanted to get through this class, through this assignment, so they could go on and live the rest of their life, right? It wasn't necessarily, they didn't necessarily have the same goals that I had. So what were the goals that we have as a tutor working with the student? I think that, the big goals that we have, we want to be helpful. We want to help students understand the content. I know as a tutor, I was always tutoring in areas that I really loved, and I presume the areas you're tutoring in are areas that you really enjoy, that you really love. So part of my goal as a tutor was to make students understand, how interesting this content really is. I kind of wanted to win them over to whatever course I was tutoring them in. Our big goal and ask, as you've seen when we looked at our mission statement, is to help build independence, right? To help students become successful, independent learners, to work yourself out of a job. So to do that, what we need to do is we need to help students develop good study skills that are transferable, study skills that will help them with the particular assignment they're working on, but that will also help them the next assignment, the next course, throughout their entire academic career. So our goal is to help build those independent study skills. And what we're going to talk about in this session today is how can we structure the time we spend with the student to help develop those study skills. All of you are going to be tutoring in very different forms. Some of you will be working exclusively in help sessions. Some will be working in the writing center. Some will be individual tutoring. And really the ideas we're going to talk about today fit any of these different sort of tutoring formats. I'm going to talk about this in terms of an individual tutoring link up, but really everything we're talking about is transferable to any of those other settings. Before we get to the model for how to think about that time we spend with our student, I want to think about a couple other things that really will help to shape that tutoring session. The first is the place. Wherever you decide to work with the student, you want to make sure it's a place that's really conducive to the type of work that you're going to be doing. So you want to find a place that's going to be distraction-free, both for the student and for you. Now at Bethel, there's lots of different places you could work with the students. Some are good, some are bad. For some of you working in the writing center, working in help sessions, the place you tutor is going to already be determined by the nature of the lab or the writing center. But if you're doing individual tutoring, you're going to have some say in where you work with the student. So what are some places that are really maybe not the best places on campus to work with the student? Well, they're going to be high traffic areas. So the Brushhopper Commons, probably not a great place. There's a lot of traffic, a lot of noise, a lot that could potentially distract either you or the student. Same with places like the 3900 Grill and even parts of the library. Some of the main high traffic areas of the library are maybe not the best place to do tutoring because of the potential for distraction. So what are good places to work on campus? Well, some of the sort of study rooms in the library are great. Some of the places a little bit more on the outskirts of the library can be great places to study because there tends to be less distraction there. Empty classrooms, if you can get them, are spectacular because you'll have, often a computer, a projector, whiteboards or chalkboards, places where you can kind of spread out, different tools that you can use to help you in communicating with the student. If you're tutoring in the sciences and you can get access to some of the labs, that can be really helpful because sometimes some of the actual material that you're going to be working with the student on, you can get your hands on in those labs. In terms of the setting, what the actual setup looks like when you're meeting with the student, if you're meeting with a student just one-on-one, whether it's in the help sessions or individual tutoring or the writing center, try to sit side by side with the student rather than across the table. And why do you do that? Well, because if you're sitting across from the table, whatever the materials that you're working on, for one of you, it's going to be upside down if you're looking at a textbook or a diagram or something like that. Or if you turn it so sort of neither of you are looking directly at it, then neither of you have a very good look at it. So sitting side by side, it also sort of symbolizes the partnership that you're going to have as you work with the student on this course. If you're working with a group of students, try to sit in a circle. Have everybody kind of have equal footing. In the help sessions, this is often going to be the case, and so maybe you'll be working with 3 or 4 students. Try to sit in a circle so everybody has that equal footing. You can see everyone, everyone's participating. If more people come to the group as you go, expand the circle. Some students' inclination is going to be to want to sit outside of that circle, just kind of on the outskirts, and maybe listen in, glean some stuff from the group, but not sort of fully be part of the group, fully participate. We want to push back against that a little bit. So as new students come, as much as possible, try to widen that circle out. Try to get everyone kind of on equal footing. Then you can see everyone, and if you can see their face, that can often help you sort of read how well they're kind of taking in the information. Finally, when the student comes in, it's important that we greet them warmly. Remember, for a lot of us, it's really difficult to ask for help. And the mere fact that they're coming in to work with you show that they've made that step, right? That they want to work with you, they want to get help, they've already done that. So when they come in, welcome them in. If this is the first time you're meeting with this student in an individual setting, this might be a great time to spend a little bit of time to introduce yourself, to have them introduce themselves, get to know you because you're going to be working together. I mean, you're really building a relationship there. Now, if you're in the help sessions, it's maybe a little harder to do this because people might be coming and going, but it's always helpful to at least do that greeting, introduce yourself a little bit so they kind of understand who you are, have them introduce themselves a little bit as well. This is also a great moment in an individual tutoring session to get out those Tutor 2T guidelines. Every time that we link a student up with an individual tutor, we go through those guidelines. So you can assume that they've seen this sheet before, but it's always helpful in that first meeting to get the guidelines out and go through the guidelines with the student again. We have a spot on the bottom for you to sign and for them to sign, and then once they sign, you can, when that session's over, you can bring that to the Ask office and we'll have that on file. Why does that matter? Why is that important? Well, that helps us if the student is not following through on some of those expectations for the student. You can let us know. We can bring that student in and kind of prod them along a little bit. We can bring that form out that they signed and say, you know, this talks about what the student should be doing to prepare. It talks about the fact that students shouldn't be missing tutoring sessions or things like that. So that is really a helpful thing to help kind of lay a groundwork for expectations in working with a tutor. So what I'm going to present today is kind of a 3-part model for thinking about the time that we spend with our 2T. And again, this model works whether you're looking at a help sessions, whether you're working in the writing center, or whether you're looking at an individual tutoring session. I'm going to talk about it primarily in terms of an individual tutoring session, and I'm going to think about that session as lasting an hour. But the same concepts are going to apply regardless of the tutor setting. This model that I want to talk about I call the past, present, future model of structuring a tutor session. So we're going to start with the past. The past matters because this is where we get continuity from one tutoring session to another. This is also the moment where we can start to focus in on study skills. Remember, we said that's going to be our primary goals. We want to help the student become an independent learner with these really good study skills. And sometimes it's hard to focus purely on study skills when we're diving directly into content. So by focusing on the past a little bit, it gives us sort of a clean moment to think about what the study skills that the student has and what the study skills that the student needs, what those are and how we can start to develop them and then start to apply them to content. The other thing that this allows you to do is it allows you to know sort of where the student is struggling and what areas of the course the student's doing well in. This is kind of giving you a lay of the land of who that student is as they're coming in to meet with you. This past section of the model is not a huge amount of time. If we're thinking of meeting with the student for an hour, this is about 10 minutes out of that hour. So not a huge amount of time, but a really crucial and important amount of time. If the past centers around a question, that question is something like, how are things going in this course so far? So this gives you a chance to figure out kind of where the student's at, where their struggles might be. It helps you to think about what have they done to prepare so far. You can ask follow-up questions, in terms of how did the last exam go, and then dig a little bit deeper. Some students are going to, you'll ask them 1 or 2 questions and they'll sort of tell you everything you need to know. Others you might need to dig a little deeper on, and you can ask things like, tell me about the last exam. Tell me about what you did to prepare for that exam. Did you struggle on every part of the exam, or were there certain parts that went well and other parts that didn't go as well? This is helping you know what you're going to need to focus in on. It's also helping you think about what work the student has done so far, what's working for them, what's not working for them. If you're working in the Writing Center, this might take the form of really asking them about this paper that they're giving you to look at. So it's going to be talking about what is the assignment, what is the assignment that they're supposed to be doing in this paper, and kind of what is the narrative of this paper that they're working with you on. What have they done to put this paper together so far? Where did they hit roadblocks? What were the things that sort of went easily? What were the things that were difficult? When you ask follow-up questions, make sure you're asking these in a positive way. I mean, the student's coming in because they're struggling likely, so you don't need to build that into the question. Don't ask the student, what's going wrong in chemistry, or what's the big struggle in calculus, or, what's so difficult about economics. You don't need to ask them that. Just ask them, how is the course going? And they'll tell you where the struggles are. They're coming in to work with you probably because there are some struggles. So stay positive and let them tell you about themselves as a student. Your goal here is to figure out what's going well for the student, but also what are the areas in which the student might be struggling or needs some help. You're also going to learn a little bit about the students' attitudes towards the class. Is this a class that they really enjoy, but they're struggling with the concepts? Or is this a class that they're taking because they need it for their major, or because it's a gen ed course that they need to graduate, but they're really not enthusiastic about the class? Knowing where the student's at in terms of kind of their attitude towards the course can shape the way you talk with them about the subject matter. If they're very enthusiastic, you don't need to do a lot of selling to them as to why this is important or why this is interesting. If they're not as enthusiastic, you might need to do a little bit more of that. So trying to gauge that in this initial sort of moment can help you kind of guide where you're going to go as you're working with the student once we start to dive into content. One of the nice things about taking this 10 minutes to focus on the past is that here we can really start to talk about study skills. As the student's talking about what they've done to prepare before they've met with you, what they've done to prepare for this paper, what they've done to prepare for the last exam, all of those things, what they're really revealing is their study skills. And this gives you a chance, before we dive into content, to start to see, are there gaps? Are there things that they should be doing that they're not? Or are there things that they're doing that seems like, that sounds really great. If that's helpful to you, let's keep doing that and let's add something to it. This is a sort of a purer moment to talk about their approach to study, their study skills. Now, I'll let you know, don't make a lot of big assumptions about students and study skills. Sometimes I'll work with students and they'll say, I really studied a lot for this class. And I'll ask them, well, what does that mean? And they say, well, I studied. And I said, well, tell me what studying is. Tell me what that actually looks like. And when they start to talk about it, I realize they have a pretty narrow view of what it means to study. I mean, maybe they just say things like, I just reread my notes again and again, which is, that's a way to study, and that can be a perfectly fine way to study. But maybe there are other approaches that might be more effective for the students. So, this gives you an opportunity to learn a little bit about kind of their scope and understanding of what studying could be, and to present some of those study skills ideas right before we dive into content. Ideally, it's nice to have these conversations even in a help session situation, although that might feel a little bit awkward to you at first because the student's coming in saying, can you help me with this particular assignment? Our inclination is to say, okay, they have a specific question, let's dive into that content. But spending a little bit of time getting to know what they've done even to begin to prepare for that assignment, what they're understanding, what they're not understanding, might help to gauge, are there underlying issues that are making this assignment difficult, making this question difficult. And if you're working with a group of students, this can actually be a really helpful thing because what the students get to do is hear each other. They get to hear that other people are struggling in this course too. That can kind of be affirming to students who sometimes feel like they're the only one who's struggling. They're the only one who, maybe doesn't get it. It's also helpful because students can start to hear that different people have different approaches to study. One student might say, I made flashcards and that was really helpful for this thing. Another student in the group might hear that and say, wow, it never occurred to me to make flashcards or do something like that. So even though focusing on the past in a small group or in a help sessions, might feel like, I don't know if that's the best fit, I encourage you to give it a try because it can start to open up some of these study skills conversations. Now that we've spent some time focusing on the past, now we want to dive into the second part of this structure, which is the present. And when we look at the present and why the present matters, this is helpful because we can start to dive into specific student questions. We can start to dive into specific course content. The present is what we tend to think about when we think about tutoring. It's working with student on course content, reviewing information, reviewing notes, things like that. If the past is about 10 minutes out of the hour, the present is a much larger chunk of time. This is about 2/3 of the time we spend with the students. So about 40 minutes out of the hour. What question does the present center around? It really centers around the question of what are you doing in the course this week? Some of the typical things we might do while we're focusing on the present is to review content, review lecture notes. Sometimes it's really helpful to have a student get their notes out and teach the content to you. And that may sound a little strange because why would the person who's struggling in the course be the one who's leading the ship in terms of teaching the content? Well, oftentimes when we teach something, when we try to explain it, there might be something that we feel like, yeah, I understand this idea pretty well, but once I start to explain it to someone, I start to see the gaps. I start to realize like, even as I'm explaining this, it doesn't really make that much sense. So having the student teach you is a great place to see those gaps, especially if they feel like I'm just really generally struggling in this class, but I'm not even sure what questions I have. Having the student teach through their notes to you can be very helpful. Here's also where we can start to work on homework problems, where we can start to work on practice problems, things like that. So really a way to think about the present is those study skills that we started to talk about during the past. Now we can start to actually apply those study skills to the course content. And here's where we can start to expand students' views of what studying might be. So I often will work with students in a course like CWC where they have, or any course where you have a lot of vocabulary you need to know. A lot of first-year courses are going to be sort of content heavy in that way. There's just a lot you need to know, whether it's CWC or a course like anatomy, things like that. There's lots of courses where you just need to know definitions, you need to know formulas, there's ideas you need to kind of get locked down on. So oftentimes what students will do is they'll make things like note cards, which is a really good study tool. In a typical note card, you have the term on one side, on the back you have, here's the information you need to know. And students will oftentimes do that, and I'll ask them, okay, well, what do you do once you've made the note cards? And they say, well, I'll sort of have my note cards with me, and I'll read a term, and then I'll kind of recite in my head, okay, here's what it is, then I'll flip it over and see how I did, which is a perfectly fine way to study. But if the student needs more, and oftentimes they do, the problem is that what we should do is we should be making our study as much as possible look like the exam we need to take, look like the way we're going to be assessed on this. And if you think about that student who's studying, reading the question, reciting it in their head, flipping it over, that student is preparing for an exam where the prof gives them a question and they need to recite the answer in their head. Now, I've taken lots of tests in my life. I've never had a question where all I had to do was recite the answer in my head, right? So we want to think about what makes a test difficult. What are the components of a test that we should add into our study and that you can add into your study as you're working with your student? There's really 5 things I think that make tests difficult. First, you have a limited amount of time. Second, you're in a quiet room, distraction-free space. Sometimes that can make it more difficult for students. Third, you don't have your notes with you. So you have to rely on sort of what you have in here and how you can get it out. Fourth, you don't know what you're going to be asked. And fifth, you have to write your answers down. You have to commit to an answer. So if in some of the time you're spending with the student, you can help them do this sort of practice testing and show them ways they can do this on their own, that can be really helpful. Quiet room, limited amount of time is really easy, right? You're probably already in a quiet, distraction-free room. Limited amount of time, do little microbursts of this. So have the student, set their cell phone for 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever amount of time you want to do. Have them put their notes away. They don't know what questions are going to be asked. That's where you can come in, because you can pick some note cards out, or you can just give them a question and say, okay, we just talked about this idea. Now here's a question about it. And they have to write it down. This one's crucial, because I think very often students, the way they study is entirely auditory. They'll recite things, they'll read things, they'll recite things, and that can be helpful. But on the test, what they need to do is they need to commit those ideas to paper. They need to write it down. And if we go back to that student who's looking at their note cards, reciting it in their head, when they flip that note card over and compare, they're comparing what they said in their head to what they wrote here. And very often, we kind of let ourselves off the hook. We say, that's pretty much what I said. When you have to write it down, you're committing to say, this thing that I wrote, that's what I'm going to be graded on. So have them take the time to write it down. And then this is something they can do when they work with you, but it's also something they can do just generally in their studying. That's why note cards are helpful, because you can shuffle them up and deal out a practice test for yourself. A couple things to remember as you're working with the student, especially when you're digging into content. First off, as much as possible, try to put all materials in the hands of the student. So if there's writing to be done, if there's looking things up in a book to be done, it's really easy for you to do that because you know the stuff and you know what you want written, things like that. But that's creating a situation where the student is more passive and the tutor's the active one. So as much as possible, always put the writing utensil in the hands of the student, and always have the student be active as much as possible in that tutoring. A second thing to be aware of is student dependence. And this can be a tricky one as a tutor, because it feels great to tutor someone. It feels great to help someone. But remember, our goal is to have the student work towards independence. Work towards this point where they don't need us, where we work ourselves out of a job. So although it feels great to have that student come up afterwards and say, I worked with you and I got a B+ on this test, and it's all because of you. That feels great to hear. But every time we hear that, we need to be thinking, okay, but what do we need to say back to that student? They didn't do well because you fixed all their problems. They did well because they worked hard, right? They took some of those ideas that you talked with them about, but they applied those ideas. They applied those study skills. So whenever you're noticing the student getting sort of too dependent on you, try to push back on that dependence and remind the student that this is really going to be about the work that they're doing both with you, but especially the work they're doing once they walk away from you. Because 2 hours a week with you is definitely not going to be enough for them to master the material and do well on an exam if they're not going to study beyond that. One more piece of advice that I would give you as you're tutoring, and this is probably the best advice that I have. If you get nothing else from this video, if you hear this piece of advice and are able to apply it, you'll be a better tutor for it, is that when you ask a question to a student, or you're having a student explain something to you, don't be afraid to let silence be a member of the group. And what I mean by that is, some of us, and I'll point to myself as an example of somebody who doesn't always do this well. When I'm in class, I'll sometimes ask a question to my small group, and I'll expect them to answer. But I don't love silence, right? I feel like that feels really awkward. So after about 2 or 3 beats, I jump in and I answer the question myself. And my students learn this, right? They learn this by the second day of class, that if they just keep quiet, Mulberry's going to answer his questions by himself. So what we need to do is remain silent. And I'm teaching them a really terrible thing. Instead, when you ask a question, let it sit there. Be silent. Let silence be a member of that group. And what you really want to teach the student is, no, I really do want you to try to answer this, to put an answer out there. It doesn't need to be perfect. And once a student gives an answer, you can jump in and start to, massage it a little bit and say, okay, that was great. Here's some other things we need to think about. But teach them that you really do want them to be answering these questions. You really do want them to be active in this tutoring. We've talked about the past. We've talked about the present. So now we're into that last section of the tutoring session, that last 10 minutes or that last 1/6 of the time that we're spending with the student. And that is the future. It matters because it helps the students see that studying is a process where you as the tutor is a guide and a help, not the fix, not the solution. It helps them have some direction as they walk away from you to what they need to do next. Right? And it gives them some goals for the next time that they're going to be meeting with you. If the past centers around a question really is, What does the next week look like in this course? Or what do you have coming up in this course? Or if you're working in the Writing Center, now that we've worked through some of this material, what are the things that you need to do next? Maybe we've talked about a couple things that we saw as consistent errors in this paper. We fixed 2 or 3 of them. So one of the things is now you should go through and find the rest of those. A good way to help a student sort of think about what they need to do next is to have them get out their syllabus or open up Moodle, get out their schedule for the course, and start to think about what are the assignments that are coming up, what are the next steps that are coming up for this course. And then help them build a to-do list. So help them go through that syllabus and say, okay, what are the things that we should be putting on here for the next week? But then you want to make a pivot to say, along with the things that are in the syllabus that you need to do, you should also be thinking about what are the other things you need to do as a student to be successful. And this is where, again, we get back to study skills. We get back to being a successful independent learner. We get back to you as a tutor being somebody who really serves as kind of a model student for the 2T that you have. The important thing is not to dictate a to-do list to them, but to help them generate that list. The first time you do this, you might need to be a little bit more active in helping them think about what some of those pieces are. But after 2 or 3 times of doing this, they're going to start to automatically be putting things on that to-do list. Some things to do as they're putting that to-do list together is help them break big projects into small things. So let's say that one of the assignments they have for the week is that they need to read this 50-page chapter for the next week. Ask the student, when you're reading that textbook, how many pages can you read before your brain starts to shut down? Because if your answer is 10, and that's perfectly fine, if your answer is 10, then putting read 50 pages on a to-do list isn't really a helpful item. That's more than one task, that's 5 tasks. But if you put it in as one task, that's the kind of thing we tend to procrastinate on. We tend to push off till later. So make every task manageable and accomplishable. Break the big things down into small things. Remind students of the things that you do, the things that other good students do to be successful, because you're going to be a crucial voice in this. I'll give one example. So oftentimes in science courses or in math courses, one of the things that a really good student does is they do practice problems. And practice problems are important because they give you more practice with the content, more practice with the formulas, with the ideas that you're going to be doing, and they're going to look a lot like what you're going to see on the exam. Now, why do students sometimes not want to do practice problems? Because you don't get credit for them, because they're practice. And as a professor, I can say to a student in my class, yes, you should do practice problems. That's going to be really helpful. And the student's going to look at me or look at their other professors and say, well, you're supposed to say that. It's your job to tell me I'm supposed to do work I'm not going to get credit for. And you're kind of a weird person because you've dedicated your life to this narrow little academic field. But if they hear from you as the tutor that you did practice problems and that lots of students do them, that helps to kind of normalize that as an activity. Because they look at you and you look like a pretty normal person and you actually do practice problems. So this is where you can normalize some of those things that good students do. So help them realize what those other study skills are and help them build a solid to-do list. Along with building the to-do list, if you're working individually with this student and you're going to see them again for another session, this is a moment to say, okay, let's schedule when and where we're going to meet next. Because that to-do list really is your goal for what they should do by the next time you meet. And then when you meet them the next time, when you do the past section of your time with them, it's not just a general, how are things going in this class, but it's getting that to-do list out and saying, well, let's see how many of these things did you get accomplished and how did it go? You tried studying in this new way. Was that helpful? How did it go? If this is a student that you're working with in a help session or the Writing Center, this is an opportunity to invite them back to say, if this was helpful to go through this paper together, or if this was helpful to work in the help sessions with me and with some other students, you should come back. Let them know how to sign up for another appointment. Let them know what the overall schedule is for your help sessions. Maybe even let them know what your work schedule is to say, I work on these nights. You should come in. This worked really well. You should come in and we should keep doing this, right? Invite them back in to keep working with you, to keep this process of getting help and working with a tutor going. In this training, we've talked about how to structure a tutoring session, how to focus on the past, present, and future when you sit down to work with a student with that goal of helping them become a successful independent learner. I hope this was helpful to you as you're preparing to work with students. And please know that if you have questions about this or about anything else that comes up as you're working with students or as you're preparing to work with students, please come by the Ask Office, HC 324, and meet with one of our directors or one of our counselors. We'd be happy to give you more advice about how to work best with students.